Thank you very much, Rishis Rabbi Black, Rabbi Willig. The subject of today's shir is really a few things, but it revolves around the whole Quicken loans hullabaloo from approximately 5 or 6 years ago, when it was discovered that this company that was in the business of making mortgage loans, obviously with interest, was owned pretty much 100%, maybe 93%, by a fellow who is Jewish. And there were all of these Jewish borrowers who were taking these loans without any kind of an awareness that they were violating iska ribbis. There was a kol koreh, there was a proclamation that was put out by a number of rabbanim, a lot of them from Lakewood. And the truth of the matter is the kol koreh was a culmination of conversations and correspondence that had taken place over the previous 5 years with Quicken loans from concerned borrowers who found out about the identity of the ownership and wanted to understand why it should be mutter for them to take these loans. And they consulted with their poskim, and gradually more and more poskim realized they can't take these loans and that it was 100% usher. And there was an effort by many rabbanim to try to convince Quicken loans to do a heter iska, to at least alleviate the problem, whether it would be mitzvah min mufchar or lechatchila, but at the very least a b'di'evet, to have a heter iska klali in place. And they resisted for a very long time. I have to say I was one of those rabbanim who corresponded with various agents of Quicken loans going back probably to 2014 or so. And finally this kol koreh seemed to be the kick in the pants that did the job. And within a couple of months after the kol koreh, there was some sort of a heter iska klali that was apparently put into place of mysterious nusach. Where does it exist? What exactly is the nusach? Was it ever signed by anybody? I can't answer all those questions per se, but it raised all kinds of different questions regarding, number one, determining the ownership of corporate entities. When is a bank considered to be Jewish? So that we would consider that to be a problem. Like with respect to Quicken loans, how much of a Jewish ownership is needed? Certainly 100% would seem to do the job, as with 93%. Secondly, if there is a need for a heter iska, does a heter iska klali do the job? Or do you need a heter iska really for every single situation? And does it depend upon the level of sincerity, shall we say, of the lender, to the degree that you can rely upon a heter iska klali, or whether anybody in their right mind thinks that they would ever be able to enforce it? Yes?
What motivation do they offer initially to the resistance?
I'll tell you in a moment.
Okay.
There's a very interesting explanations that they gave, lumdus. They had all kinds of lumdus as to why they didn't require a heter iska. Number three, and this became a very hot topic, it still is a hot topic, that some understand very well. Some just sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, if this is what the experts in hilchos ribbis say, then I guess I'll go along with it. And some don't understand it at all, which is the notion of does the problem get solved only when the loan remains with the Jewish mortgage originator, or does the problem continue to be solved if the mortgage loan is assigned? Let's say that within a month or two after the mortgage is originated by Quicken loans, which is often the case, especially with mortgage originators nowadays, that they don't hold on to the loans. In fact, very few mortgage loan originators hold on to the loans. Eventually they get sold. So you have a whole question there. If it's going to get sold, can you assume that it would be sold to a non-Jewish entity? Or you have to be worried it's going to be sold to a Jewish entity. If it's sold or assigned to a Jewish entity, does the iska that you entered into with the first entity continue to pertain to the second entity? And what really flummoxed people was that this groundbreaking article was published in the Yeshurun Journal that apparently had the haskam of Rav Yosef as well, that said you may have a bigger problem if you assign the loan to a non-Jewish entity. You assign the loan to a non-Jewish entity, they're not interested in the iska, but deep down, you know what? It's really still considered to be a Jewish loan, even though it was assigned to the non-Jewish entity. So some people said, oh yeah, you betcha. And some people said, I don't know what you're talking about. But that also became a big issue with respect to Quicken loans because That's basically what would happen with Quicken loans. So if you entered into the heter iska and then a month later they would assign the loan to somebody else, even a non-Jewish entity, maybe it would be a bigger problem if it's a non-Jewish entity not interested in a heter iska, so then you might be even more up the creek. Somehow, in the course of these various conversations going back and forth, as they were also the various authorities and the various rabbanim who dealt with hilchos ribbis issues were dealing with these questions, including which are the entities that you can assume would have acquired the mortgage loans when they're assigned. So they spoke about different types of entities. There are entities that are like banking entities where you have lots of different investors, some Jewish, some not Jewish in the banks. And then you have various entities that don't exist, that don't consist of banks. They're just the people who invest in bundles of different loans. And they all contribute some money. And in return for their investment, they are part of this pool of individuals that each have a share in the profits of different loans. Sometimes it's what we call like baskets or bundles of mortgage loans. And in that case, some of the poskim said, well, this is kind of like a credit union. And we know that even if you're going to be mekel, if you're dealing with a banking institution where the majority of the owners may not be Jewish, if you're dealing with a credit union, so that's the kiss of death. Because as we all know, Rav Moshe said, credit unions, all you need is one Jewish investor, and suddenly it becomes an iser daraisa of ribbis, ein lecha ribbis, Chaburah mizeh. Credit unions run for your life. So somehow that became part of the discussion. So since the Rabbanim were so successful issuing a kol koreh against Quicken loans, this was sometime, I guess, around April 2018, so they figured, let's do another one before the calendar year is out. So they issued another kol koreh about to stay away from credit unions because that is the worst type of ribbis situation where you have any type of Jewish ownership, even if it's a minority ownership, with respect to a credit union. And that, of course, takes us back to the first issue. What's the status of entities such as corporation banks, which are owned by Jews? Does it matter whether it's a majority, minority, and so forth? The credit union kol koreh also flummoxed many people who didn't understand what's the difference between how we would treat a credit union and how we would treat any other corporate entity. And that continues to be a confusing issue in the minds of many. And those who signed on the kol koreh, when called upon to explain the differences, weren't able to articulate the differences that necessarily were found to be compelling by the lomdim of hilchos ribbis. And therefore, that's also something that if we have time, I'll try to explore as well. So the initial correspondence that people like myself and other rabbanim had with Quicken loans was troubling because they seemed to have a little bit of, they had an explanation as to why they felt they didn't need a heter iska. The fellow who is the Jewish owner of Quicken loans is a fellow named Dan Gilbert. We'll say Zachar Osa Ish Latov, that he eventually came around to doing a heter iska. None of this is any kind of attack, chas v'sholem, on any Jewish individual. But it took time. Obviously, a person's not learned, was not fully educated, yeshiva educated. It took time to understand the issue. So the first person who came to me, can I take this loan? It seems to come from an entity that's owned by a Jew, but this Jewish person who's the owner wrote to me. So this is 2014. I guess maybe they weren't so busy that the owner of the whole enterprise would write to the individual borrowers. So he said, here's Dan Gilbert's email to me. The person wrote, 2014. Although we maintain the servicing on all of the loans we originate, the customers make the monthly payments to Quicken loans, we sell nearly 100% of the loans we originate. In other words, don't worry. We sell the loans anyway. You're not really going to be making too many mortgage payments to me, so it's all fine and good. Basically, we service the loans on behalf of Freddie, Fannie, that's Freddie Mae, Fannie Mac, and other investors. So even though it may appear we own the loan to the customer because they're making the payments to Quicken loans, in reality, we do not own the loan. Now, of course, this is all true after the loan is sold to another party based on his understanding that the loan is considered to be sold to the other party. So I think you guys are kosher and good to go here. Thanks for your support and hope all is well. That was the letter. So I wrote back to the person Well, I don't know, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true with respect to what happens after you sell the loan, but before you sell the before they sell the loan, but I'm sorry, but after they sell the loan, maybe it's fine and good. Maybe, maybe not. But before they sell the loan to somebody else and you're making your payments to them, so you're signing all of these documents to a Jewish mortgage originator, and you're paying ribbis, even if it's only 1 month, even if it's only the original fees that you're paying at the time of closing, but those would count as ribbis. So therefore I wrote back that this is not so simple. It wouldn't matter, really, if the loan was quickly sold to another entity, if it originated with a Jewish lender, you're still going to have a ribbis, at least from the outset. So I recognized to him that, so I pointed out to him that this would still be a problem, and he should probably have to avoid it. Now, as the years went on and more people were questioning Quicken loans about this situation, they developed an official written policy for their loan brokers or agents to explain to people if they would have ever asked the question. And they had a woman by the name of Catherine Anderson, obviously one of the great authorities in Hilchos Ribbis, at least for Quicken loans, who is the senior resolution advocate, and she wrote to one of the people who turned to me to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today to address your concern regarding heter iska. There is no need to enter a heter iska with Quicken loans. So she paskin, there is no Jewish ownership of Quicken loans. Our company is wholly owned by Rock Holdings, Inc. You don't have to worry about Quicken loans being owned by Dan Gilbert. Not owned by Dan Gilbert. It's owned by another entity. It's Rock Holdings, Inc. Dan Gilbert, don't worry, does not hold any shares of Quicken loans. Rock Holdings, Inc. is owned by several individuals, which includes Dan Gilbert, members of the company's senior leadership team, and other investors. However, despite the parent arrangement, don't worry, all lending decisions are managed directly by the senior management of Quicken loans. Please let me know if I could be of any further assistance. In other words, no problem. Quicken loans is owned by Rock Holdings. Rock Holdings is owned by Dan Gilbert. So therefore, you're out of the woods over here. You don't need to worry. Everything is all in good. Not only that, but they had for their agents a question answer. If anybody should ever ask a question about do we have a heter iska, so they gave instructions. So one of the agents forwarded to me the instructions. This is kind of like what they answer. They're on the telephone and somebody answers the question. So the question is, client question, do we offer heter iska or is it required? There is no need to enter heter iska with Quicken loans because there is no Jewish ownership of Quicken loans. Does Dan Gilbert, Quicken loans is owned by Rock Holdings. Does Dan Gilbert own Quicken loans? No. Dan Gilbert does not hold any share of Quicken loans. Who owns Rock Holdings, Inc.? No, Rock Holdings, Inc. is owned by several individuals, including Dan Gilbert. So this was the standard answer that Catherine Anderson had devised. It became sort of the code answer whenever anybody would turn to them. So I explained to this executive purchase banker, a fellow, a woman, I don't know, by the name of Cody Clark. I guess it was a man named Cody Clark. So I explained to him that this isn't going to be good enough for us, for the Rabbanim, to recommend Quicken loans. So he actually, this is an email from June 27, 2017, says what requires us to enter into an agreement because there was somebody who said, I'm not going to take a loan. I asked because we have a legal team that has looked into heter iska multiple times. We run into this a lot, actually, and not once have we had to enter in heter iska because of the way the Quicken loans is affiliated. So I just want to get clarity on the topic and have our legal team look into this a little further so we can begin processing of the loan. I would hate for so-and-so and so-and-so to not close on time since we were unable to process the loan quick enough. Thank you for any and all help in this matter. So they showed a willingness to be open to consider the heter iska, and I wrote back. I said, oh, this is wonderful. The basic form of heter iska is a short document that characterizes the loan as a joint venture for Jewish law purposes, but still provides a mechanism where payment of the interest rate is rendered as a presumed rate of profit for the investment. I'd be happy to discuss with you and share a sample form. But my understanding is that Quicken loans is owned or partially owned by a Jewish individual, either directly or through a holding company, that this wouldn't necessitate use of a heter iska from the standpoint of Jewish law. I didn't hear back from that individual afterwards. So we tried, and then finally came out the Kol Koreh, and lo and behold, we had this wonderful development, and there was a willingness on the part of Quicken loans to enter into the heter iska. So let's start from sort of the determination point of when we consider a corporate entity to be problematic because of the fact that there is Jewish ownership. We know that there were many different shitos about this, especially when you had poskim who started writing about it in the 19th century, when banking institutions became more prevalent, that you would have many owners, and you would have certain Jewish owners that would be investors in a bank. And the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, of course, said that anybody who invests in, if you have a bank which is invested in at all by anybody who's Jewish, so it doesn't matter, it could be the slightest interest, and it could be a minority ownership, but it makes essentially everything to be ribbis. You borrow from it, you lend to it, you're guilty of ribbis. And the Shoel Meshiv, Yosef Shoel Nathanson, tried to talk him out of it because he said that we're going to have real serious problems here because everybody's investing in banks, and maybe we can say everything's done for a shliach, or you could rely upon Rashi, or there's Breira, that since there were Jews and non-Jews, the loans are coming from non-Jews, and people weren't so convinced about, especially since you're dealing with Isuri Daraisa, to rely upon Breira, and also everything is owned by everybody. Not so convinced by his arguments. You had the Tzafnas Paneach, of course, the rugged Shaver, who said that we don't believe this is a human being. A bank is a corporate person. It's a separate entity that's not subject to the laws of ribbis. Minchas Osher, Rav Yona Reiss, more recently, seemed to go along with that argument, but he said, but you should still lechatchila enter into a heter iska with a bank if you have at least substantial Jewish ownership because of the consideration of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. You have to take him seriously. But the basic position that seemed to evolve, especially with those like Rav Yisrael Salanter, who would say, we go basically this bittul barov because most of the investors are non-Jewish, and the Maria Levi, who said it's called the parish meruba parish. They seemed to be angling towards a theory that if the majority ownership is really the non-Jews, we're going to define the entity as non-Jews. The question is, what would be sort of the argument behind that? You have an argument to say that, well, if you're only a minority, you're not really in control of what goes on. I think you had that with the Maharshag. Rav Moshe Feinstein really enunciated that, but the funny thing is that Rav Moshe didn't enunciate it in connection with Hilchos Ribbis. Rav Moshe enunciated it in connection with Hilchos Shabbos. Somebody asked Rav Moshe, Shaila, am I allowed to invest in a corporation that's going to do work on Shabbos? Am I going to be guilty of Skar Shabbos, of having agency, of doing work on Shabbos? So Rav Moshe said, you need to understand that if you're only buying shares in a company that's doing work on Shabbos, the minority owner who has those shares is not really considered to be an owner at all in the company. First of all, the people who are really running the company says are the majority. The majority could care less what the minority has to say. But you're not really an owner. It's not a question of bittul barov. It's not a question of called the parish meruba parish, but rather it's elahu raki kona revach mehefseid. All you're really buying is a share in the profits and the losses, and you're not an actual owner in the enterprise. There's no kinyan. You have the right to select a president, which the Minchas Yitzchak considered a voting right to be very significant. He said, come on, what do you do with the papers that you get from your various companies that you own stocks in, and they send you a prospectus in the mail? You put it in paper recycling. It's just something. It's just there to flatter you up, as if you have some significance. You don't really. These were the only words of Rav Moshe that everybody picked up on. These words. If Rav Moshe wouldn't have said these words, the tshuva would be useless. But he said these words. He said, that the people who are really running the company are leaving for themselves more than the majority. That's all that matters. Is that what Rav Moshe was really saying? He was saying that you're not really running the show. Since these people who are running the show have more than Rov, so therefore, for sure, the minority is not running the show. Shalosh shayach. Deah. It's not shaykh that anyone cares what you're going to say. And even the people who invest are not looking to really have ownership control. So therefore, you don't have to worry what the people who really have control are going to do. They have no control over that. The last part of what Rav Moshe said, people paid less attention to because not as helpful for our purposes. So you pay attention to what's going to be helpful, obviously. But Rav Moshe in the end said, but if you're going to buy a significant percentage that your opinion is going to matter, so then already you might have some responsibility for what they do on Shabbos. There, Rav Moshe didn't seem to say, and even if it's only 40%, and there are people who own 51%, that are going to have more of an interest in the company, so it's still going to be meaningless. No, it sounded like maybe if you have 40%, they will pay attention to what you have to say, so then it might be meaningful, but it doesn't matter. That part was left out in terms of the official codification of Rav Moshe. It's just as well, because Rav Moshe later on ended up being even more mako with respect to Hilchos Shabbos, which is all that he was talking about. In his Tshuva Orach Chaim, Chelik Daled, Siman Nun Daled, somebody asked him, can I be a majority investor in a company that does business on Shabbos? Rav Moshe said, sure. Majority, minority, what difference does it make? As long as the people who are doing the work on Shabbos are doing it adaita denavshika of it, you have directors, you have managers of the company that are working on Shabbos because it's good for them, because they're going to be bolstering their profits, so they're going to end up getting more money because they're doing the work on Shabbos, and they don't really care what you think anyway. You're just the one who invested in the company, but they're the ones who are workers, and they were charged to maximize profitability. The more profitability, the more they get paid, the more they're cut, the more their share. Therefore, you're out of the picture as far as they're concerned. They're just, you're not telling them to work on Shabbos, chas v'shalom, but if they're doing it, so Rav Moshe indicated you don't have an obligation to stop them. That was a tshuva. It was written 14 years after the first tshuva that I quoted. It wasn't even a full tshuva. It was just the last paragraph in a different tshuva. That's why it was in Even Ezer, Chelik Aleph, Siman Zayin. Second tshuva in Orach Chaim was a tshuva was written 14 years later, 1974, to Rav Shlomo Miller. Shlita, which may explain why Rav Shlomo Miller came around with the chiddush that nursing homeowners can have their facilities operate on Shabbos as long as they hire like a management company. They just tell the management company, you know what, do whatever it takes to maximize profitability. I'm not telling you when to work. Do whatever it takes. I'm out of here. And then if the management company decides that what it takes is that they have to maintain their operations on Shabbos, so that's their decision. Make sure they get a cut, not just a salary, they get a cut, so it's a daita denavshika of it. That's how you can manage the whole nursing home industry. That's codified by his son-in-law, Rav Yosef Kushner, in his book about commerce, Jewish commerce on Shabbos. Probably based upon this tshuva that Rav Moshe wrote to him in 1974. So according to Rav Moshe, I don't know. It was about rov, about miut. It was about do you have control over what's going on? Of course, Rav Moshe wrote in that second tshuva, make sure there won't be any marisayin. Everybody knows that nobody should think that the Jewish owner is dictating for things to be done on Shabbos. So you have to deal with the marisayin issue. But other than that, that really seems to have been his main focus. So where did Rav Moshe's tshuva end up having any sway with respect to how we view corporations? Well, look at Rav Elyashiv. Rav Elyashiv took Rav Moshe's tshuva, and in a tshuva in which he was answering questions that were posed to him by Rav Feivel Cohn, Shraga Feivel Cohn. So he says like this, Be'inyan ribbis heter iska. That's the heading of the tshuva. So that means everything that he discussed in this tshuva is about ribbis. So if Feivel Cohn asked him, let's say that I have, there are voting rights that shareholders have in a bank. He focuses on a bank. But it's only to choose like whoever's going to be on the board of directors and so forth. Otherwise, they really have nothing to do with the day-to-day running of the bank. Are they considered to be like the Bailim for ribbis purposes? Answered Rav Elyashiv, no, milsa de pshita. It became a milsa de pshita, which is good because I guess that since the 19th century, authorities couldn't figure out what the milsa de pshita is. But after they did all of their work, so we're able to kind of clear up all of the smoke. And after the smoke clears, this is the milsa de pshita. The Bailim, you define the entity, I said a Jewish entity or a non-Jewish entity, by the rov, the majority. And he says, and that's, he says, this is what Rav Moshe writes in Even Ezer Siman Zayin. It's true, B'nogei l'inyan Shabbos, he wasn't talking about ribbis. But he says, if it's Elishon Osham Pasha Shein Lahakshivas Akon shares the Bailim Sheilem Shum Deah B'Miskar, they have nothing to do with the decisions that are made. Below Dami L'Shutvus, it's not like a partnership where everybody has a Deah. Umah Shalafi Tanai Haskama Yesh Labale shares Das, but he was president, is only Betumei Mili, as we so forth. Kilamaisim Mishayran Liasman Yosem Erov. Because it's all about the Rov. If Rav Moshe wouldn't have had that line, we wouldn't be able to use it. But fortunately, Rav Moshe put in that line. What about Rav Moshe's line about Liknos Mida Meruba? Okay, I don't know. You'll deal with that on your own. But the main line that counts is L'maisa Mishayran Le'atzma Yosem Merov, that if you have a majority that really calls the shots, that the assumption is you always follow the majority in terms of calling the shots. The minority will not be able to control what goes on. So even if I have multiple Jewish shareholders, so Moshe wasn't talking about defining the corporation in terms of multiple shares. He was saying you're one flimsy little shareholder and you happen to have a minority. Do you have to worry that they're doing work on Shabbos or not? No, but you can apply it to whether you have a majority that are Jews, the majority are not Jews. So this will help to determine, do the Jews have anything to do with controlling the ownership decisions of the company? If the minority, they're not going to have control, and therefore he says that that's the bottom line. So therefore you look to see, is it 49% or is it 51%? 49%, you don't have a problem. 51%, you do have a problem. I would say, if you're relying solely on Rav Moshe, 49% mistama, you would have a problem too, but that seems to be the bottom line. However, certainly when you have an entity which is owned at 93%, but by a Jewish owner, so then for sure you have yourself a problem in terms of our assumption that even entities are not considered to be separate corporate people that have no human type of responsibility. But rather, if it's majority owned by Jews, so then we have an issue with respect to ribbis. Okay, now the question then becomes: so let's say that the entity agrees we're going to do a heter iska klali because it's not going to be so feasible or so simple. Or if you're dealing certainly with a non-observant head of the company, they're really the most that you're going to get them to agree to is to enter into a generalized heter iska that will simply be put on their website or something like that. But to enter into a heter iska, to make that option available in every single transaction, that's really pushing things. They're probably not going to agree to that. Also, that's going to seem like it's much more real. And they're going to be much more fearful of that in terms of, hey, does this really mean that we have a genuine joint enterprise over here, joint venture, and maybe we'll really end up losing money? So there was a whole big question as to whether heter iska klali was something that worked altogether. This idea of people entering into a heter iska klali was not even done on a corporate level. It was an idea that you just get, like every single person, to sign a document saying all of my transactions are going to be based on heter iska klali. This is an idea that resurfaces even from time to time. Even as recently as about 6 years ago or so, there was a proposal that was made in Eretz Yisrael that was signed off on Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, Rabbi Shammai Kahas Gross, Rabbi Elishmuel Eliezer Stern, Rabbi Naftali Nussbaum, Rabbi Mendel Shafron, big names, that all thought that this idea that everyone should sign the heter iska klali, that all their transactions should be according to heter iska, was something that should be reconsidered or reinstituted. It's something that would save a lot of problems, rescue people from many averos. When everyone goes to the Rav on Erev Pesach to sell the chumetz, so they should sign a heter iska klali document. So they thought that we should reinstitute that idea of Rav Alter Azriel Meir Eger. Now, of course, Rav Alter Azriel Meir Eger's idea was not accepted by everybody, and most notably Rav Aaron Kotler. I have the excerpt from his tshuva. I think we've seen it before in the materials on page 8, source 20, Mishnah's Rabbi Aaron Siman Chof. He says that it works through two mechanisms. One is a mesiras modah, and the other is the idea of kol ha'oseh al das rishona hu oseh. And he says there's a fatal flaw over here, that if it's mesiras modah, so that it's sort of an idea that you're going to define your das even if you don't remember at the time. And if it's das rishon hu oseh, so you're saying that even if you do remember, but you don't articulate it, that you're doing it based on your original mindset. But he says that works when you're dealing with a neder that doesn't affect another individual. But if it's another individual who has to go along with it, so what good is your das if the other individual is not agreeing? Also, the idea that it's sort of automatically your mindset makes sense if you're not doing something which is completely oppositional. But to enter into a ribbis transit to say, oh, everything is going to be done according to heter iska, and you're explicitly saying, I'm charging interest, I'm paying interest, and you define the terms in terms of interest, and you lay it out so specifically. So he says, so these types of initial statements become meaningless when you explicitly go exactly against it, categorically in the opposite direction. So therefore, he thought that the whole thing made absolutely no sense. But Moshe Feinstein, when dealing with the question of a heter iska klali for banks, though, said that maybe there's a different consideration. Originally, when he wrote about this subject, when he was, I think, talking about a bank in London, he just didn't feel that people will go along with it. He said it's going to be just not workable, that you'll have different rules that will apply to the Jews who are taking loans and different rules that apply to the non-Jews who are taking loans, and it's going to look very bad that there's a differentiation between Jews and non-Jews. And he said that it's and people are not going to understand, even that they're entering into a heter iska. It doesn't really work properly if the people don't understand it. So at that point in time, Moshe was really not in favor of the heter iska. Of course, he held that if the bank is the borrower, it's not a problem. But if the bank is a lender to a Jewish borrower, of course, it is a problem. So at that point, he wasn't so amenable. But just a few years later, in 1975, Moshe Feinstein wrote a tshuva with respect to the People's Savings Bank that was opened up in Muncie, New York. I remember it well from my youth, that the major investors were from my shul. They were all nice old men. I mean, to me, they were old men. They were probably around what my age is now. And they were the big machers in the community, and they opened up this bank. Really sweet people, at least from my perspective. I mean, I'm sure they were hard-nosed businessmen, but, you'd walk in, little boy from the community, they give me a $20 bill. It was that kind of very Hamish bank. And they wanted to open up, and they had to deal with the heter iska issues. So their Rav was, of course, Rabbi Tendler, so he wrote the tshuva to Rav Tendler, and he said, no problem. He didn't seem to have any kind of a feeling that he needed to reference his prior tshuva on the subject. He just said that you have to make sure. He recommended a chatzi milva, chatzi pikadon form, and the schar tircha, that for every transaction, the person who is getting the money will get $5 for investing the money, and for managing the money, I should say, etc., etc. And his feeling was that even if the people who are they were taking the loans would not understand the idea of the iska, a bank is so much better than whatever it is that Rav Aaron Kollel was complaining about, because in this particular case, everybody knows that when you are accepting a transaction from a bank, you're taking pursuant to all of the bank's resolutions. So if you don't bother reading the resolutions, that's your problem, but you're deemed to have read all the resolutions. It's like somebody signs the Beth of America arbitration agreement. It says, we agree to incorporate all the rules and procedures of the Beth of America, and we agree that we've read it. Maybe they've read it, maybe they haven't read it. But what they're saying is that they deem themselves responsible to follow whatever guidelines are in that rules and procedures because it was made available to them. So, and that's incorporated into the document. So he says, "So if yuvan shafim mekabel ksafim me'abank lo yodom klal ma'u iska yegam came b'tanai iska. It's going to all be subject to the iska via low cost suchuya sheish mekabel b'iska shekol mi shenosen kesel the bank say hurak al pi iska." Everybody understands that this is a part and parcel of the rules and the regulations of the bank, and therefore it's incorporated by definition, and this is the strongest type of heter iska. So therefore, he felt entering into a heter iska klali could really work. So therefore, a couple of months after the Kol Koreh was issued, with respect to Quicken loans, they did come around, and they agreed that they're going to enter into a heter iska klali. So the question is, was this heter iska klali good, pursuant to what Rav Moshe said, that for a bank you really could rely on a heter iska klali? But there's a big difference between this case and Rav Moshe's case, because Rav Moshe's case, you were dealing with members of a frum kehillah who really wanted to see to it that if they're extending a loan and the like, that everything, that they shouldn't be violating ribbis, and they really took it seriously, that they should follow, that they should have a heter iska klali. Is that really the same perspective with respect to Quicken loans? Well, whatever it was, there was a statement that was issued by much of the same rabbinic personalities. This was in Sivan 5778, 2018, approximately 2 months after the Kol Koreh had been issued against Quicken loans. And they said, the Hebrew language said, Lifnei kama chadashim nisparsim mixav al imsak din al das kachevas Quicken loans she'asam hilchos Torah likach mishkantim hem b'li heter iska v'atah hinenu lahodia lachenu b'nei Yisrael ki b'siyat lishmaya ke'es hiskimu chevas Quicken loans la'achtam lefarsim shkol mashkantim v'avash yimenem uvein lavas Yisrael me'ayom b'halahu al sad heter iska klali. Everything's going to be a heter iska klali v'al kochach v'al kein usu leika l'meisa al pi miktavenu. You can't aser anymore. Based on our original writing, Hanal, that we're not going to prohibit taking out loans. They didn't endorse it l'chatchila necessarily. It depends how you construe the language. This is the language everybody signed on in Hebrew. V'hinenu l'habia b'zeh hakaras tova l'chevas Quicken loans. We're so happy with them. Al hisdarustam, al hisdar zusam, v'shitu pulasam l'sakinein l'tovas l'cheinu b'nei Yisrael. Sign with Shmuel Kamenetsky, with David Feinstein, with Shlomo Miller, with Moshe Heinemann, etc., etc., etc. Rav Yisrael Reisman, who was very involved with the negotiations with the Quicken loans. Of course, the author of this English book Sefer, Laws of Ribbis, Shmuel first, the big names, Forsheimer from Lakewood, big names that you would expect for something of this sort, and they were very, very excited about it. And they put out this whole article about how they're so appreciative to Quicken loans for what they did, and we're happy to notify the public that they provided for a reliable resolution. Some of the Rabbanim were not happy with the English translation because the English translation of the Kol Koreh sort of indicated that this is something which should be a lechatchila, that you can borrow from Quicken loans, and really all that the Lashon said is su leika l'meser. So some of the Rabbanim at the time said, wait a second over here, this isn't necessarily a panacea to all of the problems that we had beforehand, because who says that they're really taking this seriously in terms of what it really means to enter into heter iska klali. So if you take a look at the sources over here, we have Rav Mordechai, who's the first one, Rav Chaim Cohn. Rav Chaim Cohn here in source 24, when they sort of wrote up all of these, this whole issue in the Yeshua journal. So he wrote like this. He says, if somebody's not a shomer Torah mitzvos, what did this person really want? What were they doing to begin with? It wasn't like People's Savings Bank in Muncie, where before they opened up their doors, they wanted to make sure everything was kedas kedin. The whole kavanah over there, what they were doing for years and years was making loans ribbis and justifying how they can loan money ribbis, because, we don't need a heter iska. That's what they really want to do. So, kol kavanah so yamitchil lahavos ribbis, shrei lekol yam humalve ribbis, u'mashehiskim laktom shtar gazem shomer Torah mitzvos. Why do you think they signed it? Do you think it was just a coincidence that it was issued 2 months after the Kol Koreh, when they're going to be losing lots of customers otherwise? But if they knew that there's a possibility of actually enforcing this thing, no way! And by the way, where in the heter iska klali would it say anything about how they are submitting themselves to the jurisdiction of a bezdin to decide that the terms of the heter iska have been violated, so that there isn't an obligation to pay them because there wasn't profit earned, or that there was an actual loss on the keren. So he says, I don't think this is a viable heter iska. The fikol amam mavua hetiv mashidiktiku rabbanim shechasmu b'lashon hakodesh al kol korei anal sheheter lehavos milvos mecheves quickens ukedoime hurakid leika lemeser. So he felt very strongly that let's focus, Rav Chaim Cohn said, on the leika lemeser ve'enu heter lechatchila. Shesov sof ha'hekrech lismach al haterim dechukim. V'akbar lam yitzchus alakeinu b'nei Yisrael. In fact, I know certain mortgage origination banks that were created in Chicago, because this is one of the ways in which some of the frum community in Chicago makes money through being a mortgage originator. They come to the CRC for heter iska forms, and whenever I prepare like a heter iska klali, I've done a couple for these types of organizations, I always emphasize that you have to make available the option to enter into a heter iska prati, with every single person who comes to you, because that's the ideal way of doing it, to show your seriousness of purpose and so forth. And there's a line at the very end that provides for the option in every single loan for the person not just to have a copy of the heter iska klali, which I insist upon, but to actually sign and to enter into a heter iska prati for this particular transaction. But for sure, that's not even the beginning of an option with respect to Quicken loans. So in the same journal of Yeshua, and this is Lamentes, Rav Yona Reiss was. This is Rav Chaim Cohn. I said he was from Brooklyn. Okay. I thought it was the boy who's dying, but I can't say for sure.
Both
yeah.
true.
Okay, so then I would think it is. So Rav Yisrael with a kuf, yeah, I think it is. Yeah. So Rav Yisrael Reisman wrote an article in the same journal saying, "What are you talking about? This is the best thing since sliced bread." He says that I was involved with the negotiations, and they're the salt of the earth, these people. It's just the most wonderful thing in the world. Mashiach's coming. I sat there with the lawyers, and they were asking so many questions to understand everything. It was gewaldic, that they really wanted to understand what the iska is all about. Beautiful. Went over every single word of the language. And therefore he said, I don't even think that it was a kulo pikadon form, because this way they felt they could deal better with all of the points and the opening fees, which are much more difficult to justify when you have any aspect of halva, and therefore you could do away without the schar tircha as far as he's concerned. It doesn't even look like a harama. People think that they're not really serious. What are you talking about? They're also actually they agreed to everything so beautifully. And it's glatt kosher Beis Yosef. That basically is the way. It's an incredible thing. So then in the months that followed, people would call me up and say, is it okay? Can I rely upon this heter iska klali of Quicken loans? I made the comment, I said, where is it? I've heard a lot of ruckus about how the heter iska. Has anybody actually seen the heter iska? So I said, they say that they'll make it available. I said, no, so try. Call them up and ask them that you'd like to see a copy of it. So the couple of people who contacted me in the months that followed, they told me they tried, and they called up and they said, "Can I get a copy?" And radio silence. Absolutely no such thing. I tried to inquire. I got in touch with the people of the Bezin Meisharim in Lakewood that were very involved. My good friend Rabbi Marburger said, "Can you get me a copy?" So he said, "I can give you something, but you're not allowed to share it with anybody, whatever." They're very, very sensitive about it. Of course they're very sensitive about it, because they're afraid somebody's going to actually utilize this. So he sent me something. I think he let me use it for teaching purposes, but basically the document that they came up with for the heter iska, it looks something like this. It doesn't have anybody's signature on it. So I don't know if there's a document that sits somewhere with somebody's actual signature. It has appropriate lashonos if in fact somebody's going to be following it. But it's very, very difficult to say. The thing that most impressed Rabbi Reisman and many of the others is that they put it on their website. So yeah, of course, they put it on their website so that the people will be incentivized to actually use them for their loans if they require a heter iska. It's not so easy to find. It wasn't so easy to find on the heter iska on the main website of Quicken Loans. But if you clicked a whole bunch of different buttons, eventually you could get there. You would have to click the button that said disclosures and licenses. In the very bottom of like the last page of where you would open up to their website, it tells you all about, learn about Quicken Loans, about us, careers, Quicken Loans in the community, our mortgage process, contact us. Then the very, very end of the page, after it has their address and all rights reserved, then it has a couple of additional tabs you can click on: email and text policy, security and privacy, and then it says disclosures and licenses. If you click on disclosures and licenses, so then it has in that section a sort of a question-answer section about heter iska. I'm Jewish, I wish to take a loan from Quicken Loans. Does Quicken Loans have a heter iska? And the answer, yes, Quicken Loans has a heter iska. How does it work? And it explains to you how it works. Nowadays, if you took a look on the Quicken Loans website, you wouldn't find anything. There is no Quicken Loans website anymore. Quicken Loans changed its name. In 2021, they changed they officially closed up shop for Quicken Loans, and now they're called Rocket Mortgage. So you can, if you go on the Rocket Mortgage website, so I did that. So this is what appears in the Rocket Mortgage website. Similar language to what they had there. I think I have it in the materials. It's on page 7, source 18. How does it work? Yes, Rocket Mortgage has a heter iska that is approved by prominent leading halachic authorities. For any mortgage made to you by Rocket Mortgage as detailed on the note, and all other mortgage loan documents that may violate the laws of ribbis, the mortgage loan will instead be structured as an investment. In exchange for the mortgage funds, you will manage your real estate and other halachically permissible investments in the way most advantageous to Rocket Mortgage, and Rocket Mortgage will share any profits and losses from the investment. Under no circumstances will Rocket Mortgage have any liability above the actual funds advanced. If you make all your payments as provided in the note, then the iska terminates and all profits and losses may be retained by you. The iska will also terminate when Rocket Mortgage sells the mortgage loan to a party not subject to the laws of ribbis. It doesn't have, it's interesting because the language that they have regarding sharing any profits and losses from the investment sounds a little bit like Rocket Mortgage is doing a chatzi milvin, chatzi pikadon, in which case there really should have been a schar tircha in this language. But again, the language that they're using is just a description of the heter iska, but it's not an actual heter iska itself. So therefore, in the actual document that I looked at, there is a schar tircha of $1, which really is supposed to get paid, and I'll believe that when I hear anybody telling me that they actually, when they took a loan from the Quicken Loans, Quicken Loans sent them a $1 bill in the mail, which I seriously doubt. So the whole thing, to me, seems very, very questionable as to whether they're really subjecting themselves to a real process by which they would really be on the hook in the event that the terms of the heter iska would come to pass. Number one, because there doesn't seem to be an actual heter iska that anybody can easily get a hold of. It doesn't seem to be signed even in terms of the version that was given over to me. And it seems like they could probably, since they never submitted to a bezdin, they could probably easily get around this, that this is just some Jewish law contrivance, but it doesn't contradict the actual loan documents. So I think that the criticisms are well-founded in terms of whether one can really rely upon it. On the other hand, I do have to acknowledge that to the degree that you want to give the benefit of the doubt, there is something on the website. There is something on the website, and therefore you definitely have to be you have to be appreciative that something was presumably accomplished in terms of putting it on the website. But that's not the end of the story. Yes. Sorry. No. Okay. That's not the end of the story. When I read the language of the heter iska, so they added something at the end, and this is the part about. Yeah.
When Quicken Loans changed its name to Rocket Mortgage, it's the same ownership.
It's the same ownership. It's the same ownership. Yeah. It was just a change of name. It wasn't a change of ownership. Yeah. I looked at the ownership holdings, and I think they said Dan Gilbert 93% when I looked it up. Yeah. Now the last lines said if you make all your payments as provided in the note, then the iska terminates, and all profits and losses may be retained by you. And the iska will also terminate when Rocket Mortgage sells the mortgage loan to a party not subject to the laws of ribbis. It's that last sentence. The iska will also terminate when Rocket Mortgage sells the mortgage loan. Why do you need that? So that's because of the concern regarding what happens when the mortgage loan is sold. And this whole thing really was a tremendous brouhaha that was created maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, when this article was written by Rav Shmuel Gersten and Rav Ava Moshe Labnuni. Rav Ava Moshe Labnuni is the author of Mishnah's Ribbis. Libanoni. He's the author, makes more sense. He's the author of the Sefer Mishnah's Ribbis, and they said, if you look at the very beginning of Siman Kuf Samach Ches, so it tells us about a certain transaction, and the Chavas Das tells us about what's really going on over here. I have what's going on in Siman Kuf Samach Ches. I have an Ovid Kochavim who loaned some money to Yisrael. We'll call him Yisrael number one, received some money, and Yisrael number one now wants to return it to him, but before he returns it to him, Yisrael number two comes along, and he says, no, give it to me, and I'll give it to this other fellow, the way you would have given it to this other fellow. So says the Shulchan Aruch, this is going to be usher, because effectively what's going on is Yisrael number one is loaning money to Yisrael number two. He's telling Yisrael number two, instead of paying me the principal and the ribbis, pay it to this other fellow. It doesn't matter if the other fellow is a non-Jew. That's the halacha in Shulchan Aruch Siman Kuf Samach Sif Yudalad, that if Jew number one loans to Jew number two and says to Jew number two, don't pay me the ribbis, pay to this non-Jew, it doesn't matter, because I'm still midin arif. I'm still directing this person to give the money to somebody else, and therefore that is considered to be an iser ribbis. And because you're still paying the money at my direction, this extra ribbis payment, it doesn't matter if you're paying it to me or you're paying it to some other person or some other entity at my direction, and it doesn't matter if the other person is not Jewish altogether. That's the halacha. So therefore the same thing is going on over here. But the Shulchan Aruch added and that's even though the loan originated with a non-Jew, and the idea, the purpose of what Yisrael number one is trying to do is just to pay back the non-Jew, but it doesn't matter, because in the process he's lending money to Yisrael number two, and he's telling him, you go and pay the non-Jew, right? It's just like if I loan somebody my credit card, and they say, okay, you can make a charge, but you'll pay the credit card company. So as we know in Siman Kaf Samach or Sif Yudalad, that's a problem, because it's considered as if the credit card company has no privity with this other fellow per se, and I'm the one who's loaning him, who's giving him the opportunity to use this money that is really my right to use the money. It's really my money, my line of credit. And then I'm telling them that you pay back not only the principal, if there's any interest, so you're going to pay the interest to the credit card company. So that's considered to be, I'm making a loan to this other fellow, and then he's paying me back the interest by virtue of paying to the credit card company to which I am directing him. I can't tell you how many people, including Rabbanim, have come to me and said that they don't understand this halacha at all. I don't understand this halacha. I said, well, it's very obvious. It's very simple. The credit card company has nothing on the other fellow. The other fellow owes me the money, and I'm just telling him to pay the credit card company. So why is it so hard to understand? But this says the Shulchan Aruch, there's a bigger chiddush with respect to this case, because this case, he says, afilu kasi Yisrael sheni shtar b'shmol lovi kochavim, that now the second Yisrael is sort of taking over the obligation that the first Yisrael had towards the non-Jew, and he's saying that don't worry about the loan that you already had. I'm taking over that loan. I'm going to pay the non-Jew, and arguably on some level, what's going on over here is that the Yisrael is simply kind of giving over that debt to the second fellow, so that there is no real debt between Yisrael number one and Yisrael number two. He was really just giving over to Yisrael number two, that now the non-Jew who had loaned to me, so that loan is being passed over to you. So the Chavas Das asked the question. He says that even though, how come it says, how do we reconcile this with the halacha that we have in Choshen Mishpat, Siman Samach Vav? In Siman Samach Vav it says in the Ramah, that there's such a thing as selling a loan. There's such a thing as selling a loan. So why don't we say that in the event that somebody owes me money, and now the loan is given over to somebody else, and the debtor obligates himself to this other lender. So now I'm out of the picture entirely. It sounds like the loan has been sold on a daraisa level. And since a new star has been written up, that the second Yisrael is just obligated to the non-Jew on a deraisa level, so then really his obligation is to this second party, to this non-Jew. He doesn't have this obligation to me anymore. I gave him the money, but now his obligation is to the non-Jew. He took over from my obligation. So if he paid me the money, why would I have to pay it back to him? So says the Chavos Das, sort of a cryptic answer. He says, that the reason why this is not true is because I haven't really given over the entire loan. When I made the Yisrael number 1, made a loan to Yisrael number 2 in this case, it was for a certain term, a certain amount of time. Presumably I was giving over the loan the same amount of time that the non-Jew had given me to pay back the non-Jew. Let's say I'm Yisrael number 1. And the non-Jew had given me 5 years to pay back the loan. And now I'm going to extend the loan to Yisrael number 2 for that 5-year period, or the duration of the 5-year period, right? So that cannot be changed at this point in time, meaning that if now he's saying that he is, I'm sort of transferring over that loan to somebody else, so that somebody else is bound by that 5-year period, meaning he can't shorten it and say, oh, I want to collect it at a shorter period of time. He's bound by that 5-year period because that's what I gave over to this other fellow. So therefore, the first loan never really went away. The first loan never really went away. So by the same token, says Rav Shmuel Gersten and Rav Ava Moshe Levanoni, that it would be the same thing in the event that you have a mortgage originator, let's say a Jewish mortgage originator, that originates a loan, it's a 30-year loan, and now they assign that loan to some other third party. That third party could be a non-Jewish lender, it doesn't really make a difference, but if that non-Jewish lender is not allowed to stipulate new terms, he can't say, oh, it's going to be a 5-year loan, as opposed to a 30-year loan. He's stuck. He's stuck with that 30-year term that was originally set by the Jewish lender. So then it's really just essentially the Jewish lender saying to his original Jewish borrower, instead of paying me over the rest of this 30-year period, pay this other guy, and therefore it still falls within the ambit of the iser Deraisa that's discussed in Siman Kuf Samach Sif Yudalid. It's the same loan. It's just the lender directing the borrower to pay it to the other guy, and it doesn't matter that there's a new star that was that's been established because there's sort of there's an assignment of loan documents or whatever. Even if as a result there's like the shibud of the borrower that we understand, maybe it was included in the original loan documents that there be a right of assignment. So there's like an automatic shibud that the new borrower has with the new lender. No, it's still halakhically considered to be like the original lender is still in the picture, and therefore, if you would have a situation of Quicken loans, even if they would put an iska into effect, since there's no way in the world that Chase National Bank or Citibank or any of these, or Wells Fargo or JP Morgan or whomever else, or is going to be the recipient of this mortgage loan that they're going to receive by assignment, they're still just considered to be they're not. It's not considered to be a new loan. It's still considered to be a continuation, a hemshech of the original loan, and there's no way that they would have agreed to this being subject to an iska. So when the payments are now being made to this other party that has the right to collect, because they had received an assignment of the loan, so it's no longer subject to an iska because they never would have agreed to the assignment of the loan from Quicken Loans in the first place if it would be subject to an iska. They would say, I want a secure loan. I don't want a loan that's subject to any kind of shenanigans or any kind of ability to be canceled or to be not get paid. So I don't want any of these vagaries and uncertainties that would arise from a heter iska. It's one thing, Quicken Loans might be pressured by a Kollel rate, but a Kollel is not going to have any kind of a ripple effect upon Citibank, or Chase National Bank, because they're non-Jewish lenders anyway. So they're not really worried about this, and therefore they're not going to agree to this type of an iska arrangement. So on that basis, they came up with a whole complicated idea that you need to have a document where it's understood that the loan documents that are being prepared in the first place, since what's being done between Quicken Loans and the borrower, or whatever the bank or the originator, the originating bank would be, and that's a Jewish mortgage originator and the Jewish borrower, they basically have an iska arrangement, and the loan documents are just loans that are being put into place for when the original iska is going to terminate, and there's going to be a new mortgage lender who will be really the first mortgage lender that will be in place. And really the job of Quicken loans, as if they understand this, or the job of any Jewish mortgage originator bank is to simply take whatever money is being given being given over up front as maybe mortgage origination fees, points, whatever you want to call it. But what that money really is doing is it's money that's meant to be paid to the mortgage originator bank for purposes of them serving as an agent to the borrower or recipient of the iska to find a lender who will loan money to them once the iska is terminated. And therefore, that's what the loan document is really all about. It's just sort of a placeholder for what's going to be the eventual loan from the real lender, who's going to be a non-Jewish lender. And therefore, this is and the money then that's paid by the non-Jewish lender to the mortgage originator is really money that is being paid on behalf of the borrower, so that this mortgage lender is now going to be able to take over, is going to be able to extend a new loan to the borrower going forward, and the borrower is going to use those funds that were paid by the new non-Jewish lender to the mortgage originator as a repayment in full of all of their iska obligations. That as long as this money is paid over, so the iska is considered to be paid in full. It was maybe supposed to be a 30-year iska, whatever it's going to be. The iska is considered to be satisfied at that point in time. Once the iska has been satisfied, now we have a real loan in place. And since the old loan is completely done and finished based upon that arrangement, then at that point in time, you don't have to worry about ribbis anymore because the original lender is completely 100% out of the picture. This was their brilliant idea. And others looked at this situation and said, why do you need to spell all this out? We know that's what's happening over here. Obviously, the original lender, iska giver, whatever you want to call him, is out of the picture once this mortgage loan is assigned to somebody else, and I have a new star. But what do you do with the chavas das? So first of all, not everybody agrees with the chavas das. The assumption, but they say that they asked this of Rav Yosef. So did they ask this of Rav Yosef? Yeah, let's take a look at Rav Yosef over here. This is in source 16. So it's in the same shuva by Rav Yosef, and this was also a question that was posed by Rav Shraga Cohen. He said like this. He said, "Akone bias and mekav mishkanta mi bank shel yisor beheter iska motzim yot shetoch eiz yom bank mocher achov lebank shel nachrim." That the loan is going to be sold over to a non-Jewish bank. They don't know that this is based on heter iska. Is that not a problem of ribbis? So it sounds a little bit like Rav Yosef was befuddled by the question, like maybe they didn't have the right to do it. So he says, well, they didn't ask in the question. It didn't say, oh, and then the loan documents say, of course, that the bank has the right to assign the loan to somebody else. So he says, ooh, that sounds like a very serious thing. They're giving over a Jew's money to a non-Jew, and who knows what terrible things they're going to do in terms of their trampling upon this Jewish borrower and taking away all of his money and oppressing him. So he says, you're giving over a Jew's money to a non-Jew. That's a terrible thing. What? They're just a kind of misappropriating his money. So then it's as if a person is forfeiting the money of a Jew to the whims of the non-Jewish collectors, and who knows how savagely they're going to treat him. That they would do such a thing. So it would have been better probably had the question said, of course they have the right to do it. The question is just from a ribbis perspective, is this going to be problematic? So it says, so if it was known ahead of time that it would be okay to assign to the non-Jew, so then he says, and this sounds like basically what Rabbi Gersten and Rabbi Lebanoni were saying, it sounds like then he's loaning money to a Jew, that the original loan was basically being made for the purpose that if the lender should want, he'll direct the borrower that you should pay the ribbis to this non-Jewish entity. So that very terse answer by Rav Yosef seemed to justify essentially the concerns that were expressed by the authors of this article, and therefore they came up with this very long and convoluted shtar heter iska klali, which I received from the Vada ribbis of Lakewood, and that's in your materials on page 4 to 6 and so forth, and explains basically that this is the setup of the whole arrangement is that it should not be viewed as simply an assignment of the original loan, of the original extension of funds by the first provider to the recipient to somebody else, because then that will run afoul of the concern of the Chabad Das, because it's for the same loan term. The loan term will be the same as the iska term, except it will be without the iska, and then it would end up going from what happened in iska to fundamentally a ribbis loan situation, which would be untenable unless you can somehow say that the original provision of funds is completely done and finished, and that the new loan is essentially some new type of an entity, and that's the only way that it could be countenanced. But the truth is that, as the Sheris Chaim points out, the Chabad Das, the way that the Chabad Das reads appears to be very, very difficult, because the pashtus is that if you really did have a full-fledged assignment of a loan, so then the first lender really is 100% out of the picture, and the new entity is the only lender that's in the picture, and it's not like a Simon Kuf Samach Sif Yudalit situation. So and where do we find this? We find this really in the other sifim of Shulchan Aruch, Simon Kuf Samach Ches, Kuf Samach Tes. Because you have in sort of a reverse situation, the Taz discusses this in Sif Yud. What's the situation? Well, you can have three types of different situations, and the Taz really addresses the last two, and the Chelkas Binyamin addresses the first one. In Sif Vav, in Simon Kuf Samaches, you have the following. Let's say that I have a non-Jew who borrows from Yisrael number 1. He borrows from Yisrael number 1. He has money. Now the non-Jew has money. He can do whatever he wants with the money. You know what? One of the things the non-Jew can do with his money, he can lend that money to Yisrael number 2. So he borrowed the money from Yisrael number 1, and now he lends the money to Yisrael number 2. So the second transaction is a completely unrelated transaction. So if let's say Yisrael number 2, instead of paying the money directly to the non-Jew says, you know what? I owe money to Yisrael number 1. Can you pay that money to Yisrael number 1? Is that mutter or not? Anybody? Yeah, 100% mutter. Why not? Yisrael number 2 has nothing to do with Yisrael number 1. Then he has a loan from the non-Jew. Then there's no ribbis if you take a loan from the non-Jew. The non-Jew says, instead of paying the ribbis to me, pay the ribbis to this Yisrael. That's the reverse situation of what's usher, and therefore it's mutter. So that situation, 100% fine. Now, that's a Sif Vav. Now, Sif Yud, we have the following situation. You have a non-Jew who lends to Jew number 2, right? Okay? And then the Jew number 2, remember, in our first example, that was the second transaction. Here, the same Jew number 2, Yisrael number 2, only it's the first transaction. He lends money to Yisrael number 2, okay, and then he does his first transaction. He borrows money from Yisrael number 1. Yisrael number 1 says, oh, you better pay me. Says the non-Jew, no problem. I'm going to pledge the proceeds from the loan that I already made to Yisrael number 2. That's going to be security. So if you don't get from me, you're allowed to collect whatever would be the proceeds that I would otherwise get from that loan. I'm going to pledge that to you as bitachon. It's going to be bitachon. You have to have bitachon. So therefore, I'm going to pledge that to you as collateral. That's your security. So in this case, are they still separate loans? You betcha. Still 100% they're separate loans, but it would be okay if Yisrael number 2, in this particular case, pays the non-Jew. No problem. Then the non-Jew, pays Yisrael number 1. But for Yisrael number 2 to pay directly to Yisrael number 1, you wouldn't be allowed to do. Why? Because it looks like interest. It's Mexi ribbis. Why is it Mexi ribbis? So the Taz explains it's Mexi ribbis because let's say it wouldn't just be a pledge. It wouldn't just be a pledge of the non-Jew's loan that he had made to Jew number 2, but let's say he actually sold his loan. The loan that he made to Jew number 2, to Yisrael number 2, let's say he actually sells that now to Yisrael number 1. Oh, so then I have a big problem. If he sold the loan to that he had made to Yisrael number 2, now he sells it to Yisrael number 1. So now would Yisrael number 2 be allowed to pay Yisrael number 1? No. If he paid Yisrael number 1, now Yisrael number 2 actually loans. Yisrael number 1 actually owns the original loan. So if Yisrael number 1 would collect from Yisrael number 2, So then that would be ribbis gomer. That would be ribbis gomer. So that's what the Taz says. The Taz says that in the event that the loan that the non-Jew had extended to Yisrael number 2 is actually sold to Yisrael number 1, it's going to be ribbis gomer. So therefore, even if it's only going to be a pledge that's being given over in order for the non-Jew to pay Yisrael number 1, we're not going to allow Yisrael number 2 to pay directly to Yisrael number 1 because it's going to be mexi ribbis. So by the same, that's the Taz. You can look at it inside. There's the Taz 13 at Sifkat and Yud Beis and Siman Kuf Samaches. So by the same token, it should follow, according to this reasoning, that let's say I had the reverse situation, that Yisrael number 1 had loaned money to Yisrael number 2, and now he sells that loan that he had made to Yisrael number 2. He sells that loan to the non-Jew, so now Yisrael number 2 is going to pay the non-Jew, then that should be mutter. It should be 100% fine. It's just a reverse situation of what was usher. So therefore, that should be perfectly fine. So therefore, if that would be our situation then, which really sounds like what the Chaburah Das is saying would be a problem, that should be 100% fine. And that's in fact exactly what the Shevis Chaim says. That's Chaim Tzvi Hirsch Broda from approximately, this was 140 years ago. So he wrote, I have a problem with this. That because if you take a look at the Taz, the Taz indicates that in the case where the loan that the non-Jew had made to Yisrael number 2 would be sold to Yisrael number 1, that would be an iska gomer. So according to the Chaburah Das, it shouldn't be an iska gomer because the non-Jew still really is the one who's the holder of the loan. According to the Chaburah Das, if it's for the same loan term, he really should be the holder of the loan. It's all based upon the first loan that was made by the non-Jew, and Yisrael number 2 is paying Yisrael number 1. According to the Chaburah Das, that never went away. So therefore he says that the reason why, in our particular case, at the beginning of Siman Kuf Samaches, when you do have a star that was written by the second Yisrael to the Akum, it's not going to obviate the problem, is because Yisrael number 1 never said that he's assigning the loan. Just Yisrael number 2 said, oh, not only am I going to pay the Akum, but I'm even going to write a star that I'm obligated to the Akum. But there was never a star in which Yisrael number 1 ever repudiated or relinquished his own ownership of the loan and the obligation that Yisrael number 2 had towards him. If it would have been a star that he would have transferred to some other party, to the non-Jew, and said, I'm out of this entirely, so then it says Shevis Chaim, that would have been perfectly fine. And in fact, the Darach Tshuva also at the very beginning of Siman Kuf Samaches seems to indicate the same thing. And he says that the only reason why this is going to be usher is because there never was any kind of a ma'aseh that was performed by Yisrael number 1 to exempt or exonerate Yisrael number 2 from his obligations towards him. Even if there would be a shtar that was returned, a shtar that was written, it doesn't matter. Lo nifta me'alvasa shlo patru beferish, because he never released him from the obligation to pay the loan, and therefore imken adayin chayav lo. So that's why he's still obligated to him. But the mere fact that the loan term would be the same loan term that it was originally, if the original mortgage originator would say, I'm out of the picture, I have completely assigned all of the rights that I have, and if he would knock on the door of the borrower tomorrow, or the recipient of the funds tomorrow, and say, I want my money, the recipient would say, you're not entitled because you gave away all of your rights of when you assigned essentially the mortgage to somebody else. He's not going to be able to collect. He's not going to be able to collect. Nobody, no mortgage originator reasonably expects to be able to collect afterwards. At least for themselves, they're not going to be able to collect. Maybe if they're the servicing agent, they can collect for somebody else, but they wouldn't be allowed to collect for themselves for sure. Therefore, that's the difference between these cases. Not only do you have that in Sif Chav, but you also have the same idea in Sif Yud, in the Ramah. The Ramah says as follows in Sif Yud in Kuf Samaches. Let's say, it says the Ramah, I have Yisrael shechayav lo v'kacharim chovel ribbis. And now, this gives us a glimpse as to maybe what our real concern would be. If I had a non-Jew
who had loaned money to a Yisrael with ribbis. Again, our reverse case. The reverse case, not the case where it's being sold to a non-Jew, right? A Jew was the original lender and he sold to a non-Jew. I had a non-Jew was the original lender and he sold to a Jew. Whatever's going to be the din here is going to be, the din's going to be reverse in the opposite direction. So din over here is that if he sells it to the chov to another Yisrael, now the Ovei Kocharim is selling his chov to Yisrael, so the Ovei Kocharim lent money to Yisrael number 1. And now Yisrael number 2 is, or let's say he lent money to Yisrael number 2. We'll keep it simple. He lent money to Yisrael number 2, and now Yisrael number 1 acquires the debt from the Ovei Kocharim. Is he allowed to collect? Is he allowed to collect a ribbis? Is he allowed to collect ribbis going forward? It depends. Maybe. It depends. If all of the ribbis had already accrued, so then any ribbis that already accrued becomes what? For purposes of the sale, becomes principal. It becomes principal. So he would be allowed to collect that. Let's say I had a 30-year mortgage loan, and no matter what, I have to pay every single last dollar of ribbis. Let's say I prepay today. I prepay the entire amount. They say, it's great. Look at the schedule. Over a 30-year period, you would have had to pay me the $600,000, whatever, let's assume a $600,000 mortgage, plus you would have had to pay me $5 million of interest. I mean, it's very scary when you look at the total amount of interest. Plus you would have had to pay me $5 million of interest, so now you're prepaying, that's wonderful. You prepay me the $600,000, prepay me the $5 million as well. So usually there's no prepayment penalty. You can pay the $600,000, no penalty, but let's say there would be a penalty. Let's say there would be a penalty, and the penalty is you got to pay the entire amount. So that way the prepayment penalty, you have to pay the entire amount. So you know what? It's all accrued. So everything that Yisrael number 1 is purchasing from the Ovei Kocharim, it's all principal. The $600,000, the $5 million, he's just acquiring a principal loan of $5,600,000 because the whole thing has already accrued. So that would be perfectly fine. He'd be allowed to collect it. Okay, mutter. So he says if the Ovei Kocharim sells the loan to a Yisrael Acher, and so we say that that strictly speaking, if the Ovei Kocharim now collects that ribbis and gives it to the Yisrael Sheni, it would be 100% mutter. Why be 100% mutter? Because of the fact that the entire amount is accrued. We say don't collect it directly because of chomer ribbis, but strictly speaking, it would be 100% mutter under those circumstances. It should follow that the real determining factor, according to what appears in Shulchan Aruch Sif Yud, is not so much. I'm sorry. That's the case that we just described over here. That was the case of the Shulchan Aruch and the Taz. That was the case of the Bitachon, and the Taz says that if it would be an absolute sale, so then we would have a problem. Now, I meant to read Sif Chaf. It's the same idea though. So Sif Chaf says like this: Yesh le'oved kochavim chova yisrael ve'osei mo shibudim l'tein lo kol shana kach v'kach ribbis o shiyocha peru sadish lo yimei biyad dalov l'saiko v'kom laks lo mosa mut l'yisrael achar l'knos v'menu. So he says like this, that if he can't be mesalikim, that's basically what I'm talking about. That the love cannot be mesalik the Ovei Kocharim. He can't get rid of the Ovei Kocharim because he has to pay all of the accrued interest. So then mutali yisrael achar l'knos v'menu. So then Yisrael number 1 is allowed to buy the chol from Ovei Kocharim. I just read the wrong way, but it's the same case. But if Yuchal l'salko, if he has the ability l'salko, he has the ability to prepay without having to pay all of the interest, meaning, and then when the loan is sold, basically the interest is only going to accrue after that point in time. So then when the Yisrael purchases the money, the loan, you can't purchase it because any interest that you collect going forward is only accruing at that point in time. If it's only accruing at that point in time, that's when it's going to be prohibited. So therefore, a number of poskim say, this is the real distinction over here. The real distinction over here is, did the interest accrue yet? Meaning that there was basically a prepayment penalty and all the interest accrued. So if all the interest accrued, so then if you have a Yisrael that made a loan, Yisrael number 1 made a loan to Yisrael number 2, and now this loan is sold to an Ovei Kocharim, it's still going to be usher for the Yisrael number 2 to pay the ribbis to the non-Jew, because what he's paying is essentially ketzitzas ribbis. All of this ribbis that he owed to Yisrael number 1, and Yisrael number 1 is saying, all this ribbis that you already owe me, because there was a prepayment penalty that you have to pay the entire amount. Don't pay it to me, pay it to the non-Jew. But therefore, that's the usr based on the din arif and the siman kuf samach sip yudalad. So therefore, that would be usr. But in the event that the interest, this is what would emerges from the Ramah in Sifchaf, in the event that the ribbis had not accrued yet, and therefore and there was no prepayment penalty, and the non-Jewish and the Jewish lender would sell the loan that he had made to, let's say, a Jewish borrower, he would sell it to a non-Jew. So in that case, the non-Jew is only collected the interest which is accruing from after the time of the acquisition of the purchase of the loan. And therefore, that would be perfectly permissible because Jew number one, Yisrael number one, who originally extended the loan to Yisrael number two, is 100% out of the picture and has nothing to do with the length. That nobody mentions. There's no hint in any of these other sifim, in Sif Yud, in Sif Chaf, in the Ramah. There's no hint whatsoever that there's any kind of significance to the fact that the loan term is still continuing for 30 years or whatever the case may be. There's no hint of that. So therefore, it would seem, based on these other sources, and there's an article that basically was written at the time of the whole Quicken loans fix of the heter iska by Rav Daniel Kleinman. You know who Rav Daniel Kleinman is? Rav Daniel Kleinman is the one who writes up all the footnotes in the Kovas Chuvas of Shmuel Kamenetsky, and who likes to write up the halakhic reasoning of whatever decrees are issued by the Moetzet Gedolei HaTorah. He's very, very good. So he wrote an article in the same Yeshua journal, Lamites, basically setting forth these arguments. Why were these arguments very important and pertinent to this situation as to why the Chavos Das might not be halacha l'maaseh, or at least this interpretation of the Chavos Das might not be halacha l'maaseh. So it was important because you had a lot of people who were asking, what should we do? We already took loans with Quicken loans and they were already sold. So this is already a point in time in which we can't go back anymore. It's like that the illness had already set in and they hadn't received the vaccination. That essentially the loan had been sold to another party, and you can't make a heter iska with Quicken loans anymore at that point in time. But the terms of the requirement to pay ribbis over the 30-year period or 15-year period, whatever the loan term, had already been put into place. It was still in place when it had been assigned to a non-Jewish lender, and now they're stuck. So they say that every single payment that they're going to make going forward is going to be ribbis. So there, a number of poskim said, you could be including Rav David Feinstein, said there's room to be makel. So he was explaining, why did these poskim say that there's room to be makel? There's room to be makel because it's not so clear that first of all, we see from the Shevis Chaim that the Yeshiva doesn't even quote the Chavos Das, that it may not be so pashut that we hold like the Chavos Das. And secondly, it could very well be that we don't necessarily interpret the Chavos Das the same way that these authors interpret the Chavos Das. Because if you take a look at the Avnei Nezer, that source 10 in Siman Kuf Peites, so he quotes the Chavos Das, and then he says, oh yeah, this Chavos Das that he talks about that it's going to be a ribbis problem when the payment is rendered to the non-Jew, even if there is a shtar which is set aside for this purpose. He says, Ayen Sham, he explains because it's Yachal L'Salko v'chein b'sifchaf b'haga. And he says, and that's really what was being said in Sifchaf in the Ramah. But what we just read, Sifchaf in the Ramah, and Sifchaf in the Ramah was taught to Imhaya, says, as the Avnei Nezer explains, Imhaya l'nachri chov she'yisrael, if the nachri had a chov she'yisrael, me'en yachol l'salko b'sol kazman. If the Yisrael can't get rid of the chov and he's ready, all the ribbis had already accrued, so mutar yisrael acha l'knos mimenu. So then it would be mutar for somebody to buy from him. So by the same token, it would be usher for a nachri to buy the loan if all the interest had already accrued, meaning he's interpreting the Chavos Das as talking about a situation where all of the ribbis had already accrued. That's how he is interpreting the Chavos Das. But if it would be a situation where the ribbis had not accrued, and you would actually sell off, transfer over the loan to a non-Jewish lender at that point in time, and the ribbis is only going to accrue going forward because there's no prepayment penalty, so then it shouldn't be a problem altogether. So therefore you have both of these shitos. Number one, the possibility that you can sell a loan altogether. Number two, even if when you're selling a loan it's going to be problematic, it's only going to be problematic when you're selling to a non-Jew in the event that all of the interest had already accrued and there would have been a terrible prepayment penalty. You would have to pay everything. But to whatever degree there would be a prepayment penalty. So it's only to the degree that that already had set in, and then you're going to be paying that amount to the non-Jew, that it would be a problem. But if the amount had not accrued yet, so then you wouldn't have a problem. So I think that was when I discussed the union before this whole brouhaha erupted, when this idea of the assignment of mortgage loans and all the problems associated with it was published by these very fine authors, and they're very, very fine Talmidei Chachamim, no question about it. But I had a conversation with Rav Gedalia Schwartz about it, and we looked at Sif Yud and we looked at Sif Chaf in the Siman Kuf Samaches, we looked at the Taz in Siman Yud, and we looked at the Ramah in Sif Chaf, and it seemed very, very clear that if you had a real, genuine transfer of a mortgage loan, even if it's an iska that's being transferred, that it was a mortgage loan subject to an iska, and it's being transferred to a non-Jewish party, that any ribbis that would accrue going forward should really not be problematic. And he has, Kleinman has a creative solution, because he says, why is it that the author, that the Chabaz Das, why is it that the Chabaz Das, when he spoke about how this is going to be a problem, he compared it to Schivas Metaltlin. He says it's just like you have sort of like an original ownership arrangement in place. If I rented out my metaltlin, I rented out, let's say, my motorcycle to somebody, and now I sell my motorcycle to you. Okay, I rented out my motorcycle to Ruvain, and now I sell it to Shimon. So can Shimon collect the motorcycle from Ruvain? No. If I rented it out to Ruvain for 6 months, so Shimon, he owns the motorcycle. He can collect rental payments from Ruvain during that 6-month period, but he can't collect the motorcycle. So therefore he says, so the original rental deal between myself and Ruvain, who is the renter of the motorcycle, so that remains in place for the first 6 months, right, after I sold the motorcycle to Shimon. So therefore he says that there still is this connection. That transaction is still very much alive. That's the analogy that he gives. So he says that it could be that what we're saying is that since the new purchaser feels that he's being stuck a little bit, because he can't collect, right away, but it has to be only until the end of the loan term when he's able to collect. So the Chavas Das is saying that we throw him a bone. What's the bone that we would throw, that individual? We would throw a bone to that individual to say, don't worry, all of the interest is already accrued. All the interest has already accrued, and therefore you'll be able to collect every single last penny. So it's true, you'll have to wait a little bit, but at least you don't have to worry that the amount is that you're not going to be able to collect the full amount, because you get a benefit from the fact that it's going to continue longer. If I wouldn't have had it continue longer, so I wouldn't have had all the interest accrue, but because it's going to continue longer, so you're going to get this bone that all the interest is that all this interest is going to accrue. So that would be the reason that it would be usher, because it's usher in a situation where all the interest had already accrued. All the interest already accrued. It accrued for the benefit of the Jewish lender, and then I'm just basically telling the borrower, oh, now that I've assigned it, don't pay it to me, pay it to this other person. So that really would be a situation that would be problematic. But most of the situations nowadays where the mortgage loans are being assigned, where they're being sold, are situations where the interest has not already accrued because there's no prepayment penalty. It's very rare. Has anybody ever seen like a loan, a mortgage loan that you would take nowadays where there's a prepayment penalty? It almost never happens. There's no prepayment penalty. It's the most wonderful thing. People don't realize the importance. You take out student loans, for example, the importance of paying student loans as quickly as you possibly can, because you'll be paying like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars less money if you pay it right away, because otherwise you have all this interest that accrues over a period of time, but there's no prepayment penalty. When I worked as a lawyer, the first thing that I did, I worked for how many years? 5 years, 6 years? I don't know. I try not to work too much. But one of my major goals was paying up all of my student loans. And I had a big tabulation of all my different student loans. They make it very confusing for you, so it's very hard to keep track even of how many loans you have. But I was very misudar, Baruch Hashem, because this has the highest interest rate, this has the second highest interest rate, third highest interest rate. And I just figured out as soon as I made any money whatsoever from my law firm, I would pay up in full whatever was the highest interest-bearing loan, then I would pay up in full the second most highest, and within a few years, everything was completely paid up. And I don't understand the people who are suffering so terribly because they never paid up the student because they just paid the interest. Don't do that. You pay them up in full because there's no prepayment penalty. It's such an important boon that there's no. It used to be that there was such a thing as a prepayment penalty that you paid early, you would have to pay all the money that would have accrued, all the interest that would have accrued. But there's no such thing. So that's what nowadays. So that's what happens when you have mortgage loans which are assigned. There's no prepayment penalty. So therefore, all the interest that's accruing afterwards is accruing if it was assigned to a non-Jewish lender. So it's all accruing under the loan ownership, so to speak, of the non-Jewish lender, and the Jewish lender the original Jewish lender is probably really considered to be out of the picture for the most part. So that's the reason why there are many who are meko, certainly b'shas tzchak. They felt that if a person is going to end up losing lots of money, they had other solutions. Get somebody else to pay the money on your behalf without promising that you'll pay them back, based on Siman Kuf Samach Sif Yud Gimel and the Shach over there, that you can even be nice and appease somebody to do it on your behalf, or maybe b'di'evid, as long as there's no guarantee you're going to pay them back, and then you'll pay them back anyway, which part I never understood, as I said in the very first year that I gave. But they give these different solutions of other things you can do, but Lamaisa, there's room to be makel. So this is this is a whole big secondary discussion within sort of the general Quicken loans discussion. And the third thing that I just wanted to touch upon, which we don't have so much time left, however, so that our time is defined, and that would be in terms of the credit unions. What time is it, anybody? What? Well, it will be shortly. Okay. So the credit unions, it says that what's going on with Rav Moshe? So the whole big question is that did Rav Moshe limit his ruling when it came to following majority ownership in general when it comes to credit loans? The credit unions. The whole question is kind of like a funny question, because Rav Moshe wasn't even talking about ribbis in his first tshuva, but okay, we'll put that to the side for the moment. So in the Igros Moshe, Chela Gimel Siman Mem Beis, he talks about some federal credit union. The assumption is there was some credit union that was on the Lower East Side called Federal Credit Union. He says, says you got to have a heter iska. So it sounds a little bit like you need to have a heter iska, because otherwise you're going to have a ribbis problem. And he says that you have to have a proper heter iska where it's going to be realistic, that you're going to make the necessary profits and so forth, etc. He tells you all of the rules of how you follow a normal heter iska, and everybody's scratching their head. But why isn't it generally the case that the vast majority of the people who are going to be part of any credit union is going to be the majority of people in the world who are not Jewish? So therefore, why do you need a heter iska altogether? Why don't you just follow the rove if that's in fact is the situation that's being followed? So the svara that people attributed to Rav Moshe was that, no, you don't understand. In a corporation, it's based on a person's holdings. They can have a majority, but based on their holdings, even if they're only one person, but they have a majority of the stock, so they're going to control all of the decisions. But in a credit union, it's one person, one vote. It doesn't really matter how much of holdings that you have. Everyone is going to have the same vote, so you're not going to have like a small group that would represent the majority, that they would be able to, call all of the shots. And some say that's very difficult to understand, because in many banks and many corporations, you don't have any small group that represents the majority. And Rav Moshe still said that if you're only a small contributor, you follow the majority, and we assume that whoever the majority are, they're going to be the ones who are calling the shots. So if the majority are non-Jews, so you could still presumably make that argument. But nonetheless, there was a kol koreh that went out around that time. Also, 2018 was the big time of the ribbis kol korehs, and it was signed by Rav Hillel David, Rav David Feinstein, Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky, Rav Reuven Feinstein, Rav Shlomo Miller. And they said, credit union, you can't do it. It doesn't matter even if there's very small Jewish ownership in the credit union. And by definition, if you're borrowing from the credit union, you're an owner in the credit union, because you only get entry into the credit union by virtue of contributing something. There are certain entrance fees, and then you have the right to borrow at the very low rates of the credit union if you are a member of the credit union. And that runs into whole issues of ribbis mukdamis, which they didn't deal with altogether, but that you can overcome because you're not guaranteed that they're going to give you money. And there's not necessarily bailim yuduim in terms of any loan, all right, whatever. But the main argument is that you're not guaranteed that you're going to get money, that they're going to extend a loan to you. You still are subject to a vetting process. So therefore, it's not considered clearly within the realm of ribbis mukdamis. But the real issue is, are you, do you have Jewish ownership that you're borrowing from or that you're lending to, or that if you're a member of the credit union or you're borrowing from the credit union? So he says, this says the kol koreh, Igros Moshe, so Rav David Feinstein, also speaking for his father, that he held that credit union is always going to be a problem unless you have a heter iska. The heter shekasu union shares because Moshe evidence chelak aleph so siman zayin eino shayach lekan. That heter is not relevant. Why is it not relevant? So I came up with some sort of floppy reason why it's not relevant, but nobody can really articulate so well why it's not relevant. Nobody said the real reason it's not relevant, because he wasn't talking about ribbis. But it's okay. Let's assume that like Rav Elyashiv, that we can apply Rav Moshe to ribbis and so forth, but they're still not relevant. Okay. So Says, however, since there are those who are makel, after they acknowledge, so they asked they allowed that a person can ask their individual Rav. If their individual Rav is makel, they're not going to put them in chayrim. That sounds like, the basic tenor of the Kollel. Afterwards, there were some discussions that individuals had with Rav Shlomo Miller in particular, sort of pressing him. Why do you think that a credit union should be dealt with differently from a bank? And he said, you know what? The explanations are not really so compelling. So the explanation is not really so compelling. So they asked him to issue a clarification of his previous opinion. So he issued a clarification shortly thereafter. And he wrote, credit unions, whatever, all those who already borrowed, like in car loans in particular from credit unions, they have said, he says, I got to tell you the truth. There are tzaddim lahakil. Like, for example, the majority are owned by non-Jews, and that's what Rav Yoshu says we follow, right? I take back any kind of an iska that I said. I'm not going to say a heter. I'm not going to do a 180 degree. I'll do a 90 degree. In the middle. I'm not going to say an iska. I'm not going to say a heter. You want to say a heter? Okay. As he said before. But if you really press me, I think it's okay. You're going to lose money. You have what to rely upon. He says, you get somebody else to pay for you, and you're not obligated to repay him. That whole business that we discussed, to do the chatchila. So that's sort of his bottom line. Comes along with Shmuel Gersten in his article, and he says exactly the same thing which I tainud, that you can read into potentially the tshuva of Rav Moshe. And he says he spoke to Rav Eliyahu Levine Shlita, of course, is the head of the Choshim Mishpah and Even Ezer Kollel, we know very well. And he says Rav Levine agreed with him, and he says, I think that you can read that tshuva of Rav Moshe. It's very clear. He was talking about some credit union that existed in his neighborhood, a small little credit union made up of Jews. It was a Jewish credit union on the Lower East Side, and that's the reason it required a heter iska, that you can assume that it's consistent with what he wrote. Otherwise, there was probably a majority ownership of Jews, and that's the reason. He didn't say otherwise, and that's probably what because Rav Moshe wasn't requiring with respect to every single banking institution. So he says, what's the distinction? It's not because it was a credit union per se. He would have given an argument why a credit union is different from the bank. It must be that he was talking about a case when the majority ownership happened to be Jews. Venera, he says, the lav kuli amamodi. Now the Yeshiva is a ribbis. I saw that Rav Heinemann also was quoted as saying, certainly b'diavad you can be makel when it comes to the credit unions. Uve'emes shamati me'agon Rav Eliyahu Levin Shlita, the Chavis Ashrai Canal credit union like this. Makom shobale amnios himakum. The majority of the holders are non-Jews. The aim bo mishum is a ribbis. It is not an issa ribbis when the majority of the owners of the credit union, the participants, are not Jewish. End of story. Now, what was the Metzias? Dilma, ha-Metzias haisa shero bale amnios hayu shel Yisrael. He says, that it must be, he was talking about where the majority were either Jewish or presumed to be Jewish, because we're dealing with the Lower East Side, and that's the reason why he recommended the heter iska, but not because it really required a heter iska. If I'm dealing with a situation in which every single individual lender is assigned a particular borrower, and you just don't know who your borrower is going to be, but you know over time that you're going to end up with a Jewish borrower. So maybe even if it's not to the row per se, you could say the loans are going to go to a Jewish borrower somewhere along the line. It's going to be a Chaburah type of case. So then I think there's more that you need to worry about. So if you have something like peer-to-peer lending, it's called P2P lending, where you put funds in a pool, and then the funds that you specifically put in are earmarked for a very specific loan that you're going to be getting the profits from. So then I think that for sure is much more problematic. That for sure I think is much more problematic. But it's a credit union where you're basically just putting your money into a pool. You're making a general investment. So even if all the investments happen to be loans, I don't think it should really it's just a compelling reason to make a distinction between this case and when you're investing in any other kind of a bank or corporation where you simply have a minority share, particularly if the majority of the ownership are non-Jews. You're essentially investing in just, the profits of the enterprise altogether, not in individual loans per se. You're not an owner of the individual loans, and therefore I think that Lefiani is daiti. of course, subject to Rabbi Black and Rabbi Willig. Seems to me, yesh makom lahakel, with respect to the credit unions that are majority owned by the non-Jews, but my natia would be to be machmir with respect to peer-to-peer lending, and I think we will conclude with that for today. Question?
Would there be any ribbis question if the loan that was originated by a Jew, let's say Quicken, for example, to another Jew, and then sold to a non-Jew, assuming it's a full sale, and you say like the share of time, everything's going to the non-Jew. Mishum chomer ribbis, which you ask her if the money is going from hand to hand between the Jew and the Jew, like with the Jewish Rashba that the Rav quoted. I mean, not ribbis gomer, not a shaila on that, because ribbis is not ribbis gomer because it now belongs to the goy. But we should say, since the Jew is collecting the money, that whatever chomer ribbis, the way the Taz understood it, this iser derabanan should be a problem.
I don't know, because I don't know that this is analogous to the situation of the Taz, because here there is no longer really a Jewish. There's in the situation of the Taz, I have a non-Jew who is both a borrower of one Jew and he's a lender to another Jew. And no, I'm saying they're so right. But the Taz's situation was where there was he was talking about there was only a concern of Mexi Ribbis when I have with a loan that the Jew owes him is now going to be used as security for the loan that he owes to a Jew who loaned to him. That's the case that the Taz was talking about.
Not the one I'm referring to. The case that Rosh was talking about is really.
No, but I'm saying that the Taz was definitely commenting on that case, right? Because that was the case of the Taz in Sif Yud. Yeah.
Where the goy went the malva, a goyish malva to a Jew sells his loan to another Jew. The goyish malva sells it to a Jew who's going to now start collecting.
Oh, well, the non-Jew malva sells his loan to a Jew. And who's the borrower here?
The borrower is a Jew.
No, so then I have a big problem. Unless you're saying that you're talking about no. Unless all the money had accrued, unless all the interest accrued.
So the Taz says it's disregard. Except the zakah. So I'm saying on the case of zakah. So the mutter, except there we have a derabanan of it looks like ribbis when it goes miyad liyad. If the Jew pays the other Jew. Yeah. I'm talking about that detail of the chomer ribbis. Let's apply that in the reverse case, where the Jew-to-Jew loan.
Yeah.
And then he sold to a goy. I agree. So if the shares time is all sold, okay.
So you're saying he pays the non-Jew, should be heter gomer. But you're talking about if the servicing agent. If the servicing agent is Jewish.
Make the check out to, let's say, it says Quicken on it.
I don't think it's a problem. I think that if the servicing agent is not involved in the transaction or in any series of transactions involving these parties anymore, is either a lender or a borrower, so then it's not equivalent to any of these other cases that we're talking about. Because he's out of the... He
sold the loan.
Yeah, he sold the loan. Right. He's simply serving as the manager. Right, he's simply serving as the manager. And in fact, it says explicitly later on in the Simon that if it's clear that the person is only serving as the manager and it does not have any kind of a lender-borrower relationship in the transaction, that would be perfectly fine. And it would be perfectly fine.
There are institutions that hold on to their mortgages. So
I
don't know when I'm paying this person if they're holding on to my mortgage.
It goes to the whole apotropos issue. If it's so clear that the person is serving in this capacity, that's clearly announced that serving in this capacity, and it's a very regular and normal thing to do within the marketplace. So, Lefiani Istaiti, I think it should be okay. I think it should be okay. If it is very well known that this is the function that they're serving within the marketplace.
In this case, it's a better story because if they're actually still the malva, then it's mutter because they have heter iska.
It's true because if one of the things that the heter iska Kollel, it's a good point. One of the things that the heter iska Kollel accomplishes, it says that if for whatever reason the sale of the loan or assignment of the loan to the second mortgage lender will be invalidated because there was some problem with the guarantees and the warranties and the representations and so forth. So then the original iska will retroactively never have been terminated. So that runs to Abiyam's argument.
kinyan do we use? Which kinyan is considered binding?
Any Kenyan situm tovi will be fine.
We rely on that.
Yeah, I think so. Especially when dealing with the non-Jews, for sure. Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. Okay. Shkaya.
When somebody buys shares, they don't intend to own anything.
I agree with you.
That's what Moshe says.
I agree with you.
Right?
No, I don't completely agree with you. Meaning, it's clear that Rav Moshe does, by virtue of his lashon, which was picked up upon by Rav Yashiv.
But I didn't understand what Rav Yashiv was talking about.
Yeah.
That was Rav Moshe's main point.
No, but it's clear that among the points that he was making was that the general assumption is that you're going to follow the majority. Rav Moshe does say.
So I thought that
Rav
was
Moshe does say in the conclusion of his remarks
controlling interest.
that if a person is going to have a strong say, it sounds like even without a majority, I have to be worried about that. But as a general rule, if the participation of the individual or a collection of individuals is going to be significantly minor, that they're not going to come anywhere close to having that type of influence, so then Rav Moshe is basically saying that you don't have to worry about it. I think that the Chiddush in Rav Moshe, if anything, I think the Chiddush in Rav Moshe, in my opinion, he didn't say this, but I think that if you're going to have a Chiddush in Rav Moshe, it will not be in a Machmir direction, it will be in a Mekel direction. It would be more in a Mekel direction. The Rav Moshe would be more likely to say that if I had an accumulation of individual Jews, each one of whom really didn't have a significant influence,
right.
And even if I put them all together, they're not in any kind of a predicament where they would cobble their opinions together or have any kind of expectation that they're going to join with others to express any kind of an opinion. Like, let's say what would be the opposite direction. I have one individual with a 40% interest, and basically whatever he says goes, because he has such a strong, compelling interest. And all the other 60% people, if I look into them, it'll turn out 52% are Jewish and 8% are non-Jewish. Those 52% of Jew who are Jewish would not view their ownership, seriously enough in terms of really having invested in this for purposes of expressing their opinions, for purposes of running the organization and the like. So in such a situation, if anything, but Moshe might actually go so far as to say that even though the Jews cumulatively might have a 52% interest in the company, that there would not be a problem in terms of, at least when we're dealing with Hilchos Shabbos, in terms of the fact that the business is operating on Shabbos. That's what I would think within Rav Moshe. Now, if you carried it over to ribbis, I think here too, Rav Moshe is speaking about what constitutes ownership, and he's saying that if you're not part of a block, that's really controlling the company, so then there shouldn't be a problem with ribbis altogether. He's just, so I think that he would say that. I think he would say that.
So the point is, when Moshe writes about Roh, his whole point is I think he just brings that as a raya that nobody who is selling shares intends to sell.
I agree with you. I agree.
In which case, again, I don't know exactly how credit unions work, but in theory, if the way they're structured is that you control your share of the money, maybe you don't. I don't know. But if you control your share of the money,
you don't. You absolutely do not.
Okay, fine. So then, I don't know. Back. So then,
you have a vote. You have a vote like everybody else who invested, but you didn't. It has nothing to do with your share of the money. If your share of the money is 90% of all of the money, and everyone else's share is a collection of 10%, you have as much a vote and as much of an influence as all the other people who contributed an aggregate of 10% all combined. So it has nothing to do with your share of the money. It has to do with the fact that you're one of the members of the credit union.
Right. So you can talk about that being bailus because you have direct control, or you have a direct say in what goes on in the company.
I'm never saying, but you're saying
maybe. I don't know.
Your say is not of significance. Your say is not of significance unless you are part of a block. I think that Rav Moshe would say if you're part of like a block of people who, like, you are the creators of this credit union. It's like you and your family and your neighbors or whatever, and you have and that block has a lot to say about the company, which could very well be what Rav Moshe was talking about with respect to this credit union. So then you would have issues with respect to either Shabbos, with respect to ribbis and so forth. But probably at the end of the day, according to Rav Moshe, probably doesn't have to do so much with the question of majority versus minority. Right. Even though it's what did he say? Yashiv used the lashon of, like he said, pshita, that milsa the pshita. It's a milsa the pshita that goes after all. Right. I think Rav Yashiv was looking at Rav Moshe, and he's thinking about Rav Moshe in the context of the Mariel Levi, in the context of Mashag, in the context of the Sharit Tzedek, in the context of Rav Yisrael Salanter, and all of these others that made a big deal about majority. I mean, with
Right,
the
I think
arguments
that's
that you
the-
could
I
agree
think
or
the-
disagree with.
the
And he's
Riot-
reading Rav Moshe in that light. But as I
Right.
pointed out at the beginning of the
Right,
Chaburah,
I don't think it's
Rav
worse.
Moshe is not really talking about Rav, and in the end, Rav Moshe was prepared to be makel when it came to Shabbos, even if a person owns 90% of the company. If you have other,
Moreover, like when
arguments.
Moshe was asked about,
Yeah.
when Moshe dealt with corporations and banks, he didn't talk about majority ownership because that's not his fire. Moshe's not working with that fire.
I don't think so.
Moshe's only different fire.
Right. He's working with the Svara. What is your degree of influence? But he says in passing that if there is
Right,
like
so I
sort of
think
a
it's
majority that's
obviously
running
just
things,
means
so
that
obviously
that's
they're
what
the
you're-
ones who are going,
Right, because that's
they're the ones
the
who are going to
raya
have-
that the people who are selling
right.
shares, when the company sells shares, they don't mean to sell ownership of the
right.
company.
But I think there's a hanacha. There's a hanacha that if there is a group that has the rove, so they're going to have
Because when I say
control.
voting rights,
So I think
it's
that with
70 ballots, but
Yeah.
if it's going to be more, if you're merging with someone else, then you don't get a vote on that.
my point to you is, and that if anything, I would read Rav Moshe as being more meko, not more machmir. Meaning that it could
Depends
very
which
well
direction.
be right. It could very well be
Moshe
that
could be
even
meko
if you
on-
have the Jews will have a majority of shares, if there was no block of Jews that was calling the shots, that Rav Moshe would still be meko,
Right.
and it could be in the
It might be
credit
true,
union's
but-
case. What I would say, like a little more differently from Rosh Gersten. I would say it's not that the majority were owned by Jews, but there was no block of Jews that was really calling the shots. That there was a block of Jews that was calling the shots in that particular case, right? And that block of Jews could have been less than 50%, but it was a block of Jews that was calling the shots. That's how we read Moshe.
Well,
But in
they have
terms
to
of like
pay attention to.
right, yeah,
They're
yeah,
not there in charge.
right, yeah. So I still think that the way that the credit unions are set up, where we have it, there's room to be made according to emotion. And even if there wouldn't be room to be made according to emotion, there's room to be made according to Rav Yoshi's understanding of emotion. Let's put it that
It's other
way.
shit.
Yeah, right, yeah. And there's no once you're going after the robe, there's no special reason to distinguish between credit unions and other types of situations, right?